The light is still hanging over Gibeon when the line appears. A battlefield, dust in the air, men running downhill with bronze weapons and dry mouths. And in the middle of the story, Joshua speaks, and the sun is said to stand still. Then, almost as suddenly as the miracle itself, the writer points somewhere beyond the page. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? It is one of the strangest moments in the Bible. The text pauses long enough to admit that another book once stood beside its own memory, another witness, another record trusted enough to be named. And then that witness disappears. That is where this story begins. Not with a secret archive buried under a temple floor, and not with a conspiracy whispered across centuries, but with a simple and haunting fact. The Bible itself remembers books that we no longer have. One of them is the book of Jasher. It is mentioned in Joshua 10 and again in 2 Samuel 1, where David's lament over Saul and Jonathan, the Song of the Bow, is said to be written there. In both cases, the lost book is treated as something known, something weighty, something worth citing. Yet the book itself is gone. That disappearance has a way of pressing on modern people, because we live in an age that expects storage. We assume that if a text mattered, someone would keep a copy. We assume that the ancient world worked like a hard drive. But texts in the biblical world were fragile things. They lived on scrolls made from skin or papyrus. They had to be copied by hand, protected from damp, fire, war, neglect, and ordinary loss. A book could survive because one community cherished it, or vanish because no community could keep it alive through the centuries. The silence around Jasher may not mean suppression. It may simply mean the thin thread of transmission finally broke. Even the name invites reflection. Jasher is often linked to a Hebrew word, suggesting uprightness or righteousness, though the precise meaning in this title is not certain. Some have imagined it as a national songbook, some as a collection of heroic poems, some as a court record of major events, and some as a broader anthology of Israel-remembered deeds. The truth is that we do not know. The biblical references tell us only a little, but that little matters. In Joshua, the lost book seems tied to memory of battle and divine intervention. In 2 Samuel, it is to lament grief and public remembrance. That suggests not a random book, but a text involved in shaping how a people remembered their past before God. And that is what makes the loss so powerful. We do not only lose information when a text disappears. We lose a texture of memory. We lose the voice that once told an event in its own rhythm, from its own angle to its own generation. The biblical writers did not preserve every source they used. Sometimes they folded older material into their own narrative. Sometimes they quoted a line or pointed to a known work and moved on. The result is a strange kind of absence. The Bible remains, but it contains doors that now open into darkness. People have tried to fill that darkness. Texts called the Book of Jasher have circulated in later Jewish and Christian history, and some readers, eager for lost answers, have treated them as recovered treasure. But the surviving works with that title come from much later periods. Some are medieval compositions. Some are expansions of earlier biblical stories in the style of midrash, retelling and elaborating, rather than preserving an original ancient source. Whatever value they may have as later religious literature, they are not the missing book named by Joshua and David. The original Jasher remains beyond reach. That difference matters because the hunger for lost scripture can make people careless. Once a title from the Bible appears on a later book, imagination can do the rest. Gaps become promises, distance becomes mystery, mystery becomes certainty. Yet a serious historical reading moves in the opposite direction. It slows down. It admits what cannot be proved. It lets the loss remain loss. Still, the story of forgotten biblical literature does not end with disappearance. Because near the edges of the same world of memory and scripture stands another book, one that did not vanish. It survived in fragments, in translation, in the devotion of communities, far from the imperial centers that later shaped most Western assumptions about the Bible. Unlike Jasher, this second book is not only a name, it has a voice. It has arguments, it has a worldview. It retells the earliest parts of biblical history with fierce confidence and startling detail. It is the book of Jubilees, and through it we can see what the ancient world sometimes preserved, what it sometimes rejected, and what kinds of questions faithful readers kept asking long after the first stories were told. Chapter 2. If Jasher appears for a moment like a shadow passing through Scripture, Jubilees enters with a completely different force. It does not stand at the margin as a missing citation. It speaks, it interprets, it reorganizes sacred history, and it does so with the confidence of a text that believes it is not merely explaining the past, but revealing its true order. The Book of Jubilees was composed in the 2nd century before Christ, most likely in a Jewish setting deeply concerned with law, purity, sacred time, and covenant identity. It retells the story from Genesis through the early chapters of Exodus, reaching to Sinai, but it is not a simple paraphrase. It claims that the history was disclosed to Moses by angelic revelation on the mountain. That claim alone tells us much about its world. Jubilees belongs to a period when many Jews were wrestling with how divine truth was given, how it should be preserved, and how Israel should live under pressure from changing political powers and competing cultural influences. By the time Jubilees was written, the biblical traditions of creation, the patriarchs, and the Exodus were already ancient and beloved. But ancient texts do not remain still when communities are under strain. They are read again, explained again, defended again. In times of crisis, people return to origins not only to remember, but to define themselves. That is what Jubilees does. It takes the first great biblical stories and arranges them within a precise pattern of sacred history. Time itself becomes ordered. Generations become measured. Festivals become anchored in heaven, not merely on earth. The point is not only to tell what happened, but to insist that the covenant has a fixed shape and that faithful people must live inside it. For many centuries, knowledge of Jubilees in the West was thin and partial. Early Christian writers knew of it. Jewish and Christian traditions beyond the Greek and Latin mainstream left traces of its influence. But the full text survived most securely in the Ethiopian tradition, preserved in Ge'ez and treated within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as part of a broader and older scripture inheritance than the one familiar to most Protestants or Catholics. That survival alone should caution modern assumptions. What one branch of the Christian world regards as outside the canon, another may have read as holy scripture for generations. Then, in the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the conversation. Among the discoveries near Qumran were fragments of Jubilees in Hebrew. This mattered enormously. It showed that the book was not some late exotic curiosity preserved only on the margins. It belonged to the textual world of Second Temple Judaism. It was copied, read, and valued among communities that also treasured texts we now call biblical. The scrolls did not settle every question about authority, but they removed the easy habit of dismissing Jubilees as irrelevant. Here was a book alive in one of the most important scriptural environments ever uncovered, and Jubilees is alive in a particular way. It is rigorous, sometimes severe, often deeply concerned with boundaries. It expands stories that Genesis tells briefly. It names figures left unnamed. It sharpens moral lines. It shows strong interest in angels, demons, heavenly tablets, and the structure of time. Some readers are drawn to it because it seems to answer questions the Bible leaves open. Others are wary for the same reason. Where Genesis can be spare, Jubilees is explanatory. Where the canonical text can be quiet, Jubilees can be insistent. That tension is not modern. Ancient readers felt it too. A text that fills silence can comfort one community and trouble another. If a book gives detail about angels, spirits, calendars, or the hidden order of events. Some will hear precious illumination. Others will hear speculation pushing too far. The issue is not simply whether the book is old. Many old books existed. The issue is how communities judged a book's voice, its theology, its continuity with received tradition, and its usefulness in shaping faithful life. This is where Jasher and Jubilees begin to form a pair, though not a simple one. One is lost almost entirely, known through two biblical glances. The other survives with remarkable strength, yet sits outside most modern biblical canons. One creates longing because we cannot read it. The other creates debate because we can. One reminds us how much has vanished. The other shows us what happens when a surviving text presses hard on the borders of what later communities chose to center. And before we can understand why Jubilees survived in some places and not in others, we have to listen to the world it creates. Because this is not only a book of extra details, it is a book with a theology of history. It wants to tell its readers that time, rebellion, law, worship, and even the unseen world all fit into a pattern that God established from the beginning. Once that claim is heard, the book stops sounding like a curiosity and starts sounding like a serious contender in an ancient struggle over how Scripture itself should be read. Chapter 3. The world behind both books is easy to romanticize and easy to misunderstand. We imagine ancient texts as if they moved through history under glass, untouched and secure, waiting for modern readers to rediscover them. But the truth is harsher. A book survived because people copied it. People copied it because they believed it mattered. And even then, survival was never guaranteed. In Israel and Judah, writing served many purposes. Royal administration needed records. Priests needed and ritual instructions. Scribes preserved treaties, songs, laments, chronicles, and wisdom traditions. A people shaped by covenant also became a people shaped by texts, though not in the modern sense of mass access. Most heard Scripture before they handled it. Texts were read aloud in courts, sanctuaries, assemblies, and later synagogues. Memory was communal before it was private. And because memory was communal, what survived often depended on communal use. That helps explain how a book like Jasher could once be known and later vanish. If it was a collection of poetic commemorations, perhaps it remained valuable for a season and then was absorbed, eclipsed, or simply no longer copied. If it belonged to a royal or temple setting, war could destroy its home. The Assyrian and Babylonian crises did not only kill people and topple cities, they shattered archives, displaced scribes, and interrupted chains of preservation. Jerusalem fell, temples burned, elites were exiled. Under such conditions, the wonder is not that some texts were lost, but that any were kept at all. The later history of Jewish scripture was shaped by precisely this struggle to preserve identity through catastrophe. The exile sharpened the importance of law and memory. The Second Temple period added new pressures: Persian rule, then Hellenistic kingdoms, then internal conflict, then Roman domination. Every age forced communities to ask what had to be copied, taught, and defended. A text without a devoted community is a vulnerable thing. A text with one can endure longer than empires. Jubilees emerged in one of these pressured centuries. The 2nd century BCE was not a calm age of tidy theology. It was a time of contest. Greek culture spread across the eastern Mediterranean after Alexander. Local elites negotiated power. Jewish groups argued over law, temple leadership, purity, and political loyalty. The Maccabean revolt and its aftermath left deep marks on Jewish memory. In such a world, debates over calendar, sacrifice, and correct interpretation were not minor technical matters. They touched daily worship, communal boundaries, and the question of who truly lived in fidelity to the covenant. That is why the book's concern with order is so intense. Jubilees is not merely adding legends because legends are interesting. It is defending a vision of the world. It reads the earliest biblical history as if all later disputes are already seeded there. The patriarchs keep festivals before Sinai. The structure of sacred time is built into creation. Angels play an active role in mediating divine knowledge. Israel's identity is framed as ancient, fixed, and under threat whenever that order is ignored. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls helps us place this vision more clearly. The Qumran community, or at least the circles connected with those caves, treasured a body of literature wider than the later Jewish and most Christian canons. Biblical books were there, of course, but so were commentaries, sectarian rules, hymns, apocalyptic writings, and texts like Jubilees and Enoch. This does not mean every text in the caves had equal authority. Ancient communities could value books in different degrees, but it does mean that scriptural life in the Second Temple period was not yet frozen into the narrower shape many later readers assume. There were core texts, yes, but there were also lively edges. That liveliness unsettles modern habits. We often want one moment, one counsel, one locked decision after which everything becomes settled. Ancient reality was slower and more local. A text could be revered in one community, questioned in another, quoted, ignored by others. Languages mattered too. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, later Syriac, Latin, Ge'ez. Each carried traditions differently. Translation preserved, but it also shifted emphasis. A book copied in one language and neglected in another could take very different paths through history. So when later readers ask why a text disappeared or why another text was excluded, the answer is rarely dramatic enough for conspiracy. More often, the answer lies in transmission, usage, trust, theology, language, and community. Which scribes copied it? Which teachers read it aloud? Which worshipping bodies treated it as formative? Which thought it went too far? Which lacked access to it altogether? This is not a colder answer. In some ways, it is more human. Books live or die within real communities, among tired copyists, disputed leaders, changing liturgies, collapsing cities, and believers trying to decide what must be handed on to their children. Once that is understood, the fate of Jasher becomes less like a coded secret and more like an ancient wound, and the survival of Jubilees becomes less like an accident and more like evidence that some communities found in it a faithful map of the world, even while others did not. Chapter 4 Jubilees begins where Genesis begins, but it does not stand at a distance from the story. It steps inside it. It retells the opening movements of Scripture as if the world were being measured from above, with heaven itself keeping record. This is part of its power. The book does not sound casual, it sounds arranged. Creation in Jubilees is not only the beginning of existence, it is the beginning of sacred order. Days matter, weeks matter, cycles matter. The rhythm of time is not a neutral backdrop but part of divine intention. That theme runs through the whole book. History is not a loose chain of events. It unfolds according to divisions, jubilees, and measured periods, as if what God made in the beginning also governs how covenant life must later be kept. The very title points toward this structure. Time is segmented into jubilees and weeks of years, not merely to organize memory, but to reveal providential pattern. The patriarchs, too, are recast through this lens. Abraham is not less human, but he is more explicitly obedient. Jacob is more sharply tied to chosen lineage and sacred separation. The book often smooths ambiguities that remain in Genesis, or explains them in a firmer moral frame. This is not unusual in ancient retelling. Communities return to old stories because old stories still need interpretation. But Jubilees performs that work with unusual confidence. It does not present itself as one possible reading. It presents itself as disclosed truth. Then there is the unseen world. Genesis is famously restrained in places where later readers want explanation. Take Genesis 6. The text mentions the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim with a brevity that has troubled and fascinated interpreters for centuries. Jubilees, like other Jewish texts of the period, belongs to a stream of interpretation that expands this darkness. It connects the corruption of humanity with angelic rebellion, forbidden teaching, and the spread of violence and impurity. Here we are near the same imaginative world as 1 Enoch, though each text has its own texture and emphasis. For some readers, this is where Jubilees becomes unsettling. It names more, it explains more, it allows cosmic rebellion to cast a longer shadow over early human history. Forbidden knowledge is taught, heavenly beings transgress. Evil is not only moral failure within human hearts, but part of a wider disorder involving spiritual rebellion. Later readers, especially those formed by the more restrained narrative habits of the canonical Torah, have often wondered whether such elaboration clarifies too much. Yet, from within its own world, the book is doing theological work. It is trying to answer why corruption becomes so severe before the flood, why idolatry and impurity spread, and how Israel's later struggle fits into a much older drama. In Jubilees, history is morally charged from the start. The covenant people do not merely emerge among neutral nations, they emerge in a world already scarred by rebellions seen and unseen. One of the most striking figures in this framework is Mastema. The name is often associated with hostility or enmity, and in Jubilees he appears as a leader of evil spirits, a kind of accuser or adversarial power within the divine economy of testing and judgment. The book describes a moment after the flood, in which the malignant spirits troubling Noah's descendants are not all removed. Mastema asks that a portion remain, and God permits 1/10 of them to continue under his authority. For modern readers, this can sound startling, even harsh. But again, the book's aim is not horror for its own sake. It is constructing a theological explanation for why the post-flood world remains morally dangerous. Judgment has happened, yet temptation persists. Evil is limited, but not erased. It is essential, though, to speak carefully here. Jubilees offers an interpretation, not a detail plainly stated in Genesis. That distinction matters. The book is extending scriptural themes into a larger cosmology. Many Second Temple Jewish readers found such cosmological expansions meaningful. Later communities judged them differently. A historically responsible reading neither dismisses the book as nonsense, nor treats its every claim as equal to the Torah it retells. It lets the book speak in its own voice, and then notices where that voice stands closer to, or farther from, the scriptural center later communities recognized. The more one listens, the clearer the pattern becomes. Jubilees wants a world in which covenant boundaries are ancient, the moral order is absolute, and sacred time is fixed by heaven itself. It is deeply concerned with mixture, corruption, and deviation. That is not accidental. Such concerns often become sharper when communities feel surrounded, threatened, or compromised. So this is not merely a forgotten book with strange angels and expanded stories. It is a disciplined vision of reality. It tells its readers that the world they inhabit has structure, that history has hidden continuity, and that obedience is not a matter of convenience, but of alignment with the order built into creation. Whether later communities embraced that claim or resisted it, they could not have missed how forcefully it was made. Chapter 5. Among all the features that set Jubilees apart, none may be more revealing than its treatment of time. We tend to think of calendars as practical tools, boxes on a wall, ways to organize harvests, taxes, travel, and feast days. In the ancient Jewish world, they were far more than that. A calendar determined when festivals were celebrated, when sacrifices were offered, when Sabbaths were counted, and how a people synchronized earthly life with heavenly command. To argue over the calendar was to argue over obedience itself. Jubilees defends a 364-day calendar. This is not a passing note, it is a structural commitment. The year falls into an ordered pattern that keeps festivals on the same days of the week, preserving regularity and symmetry. The appeal is clear. Sacred time should not drift. Worship should not depend on uncertain observation or shifting calculations that seem to break the harmony of creation. In the logic of Jubilees, the right calendar is not merely efficient, it is faithful. This concern may sound remote until we remember the world in which the book was written. Different Jewish groups in the Second Temple period did not always agree about priesthood, purity, and the proper ordering of worship. The calendar stood at the center of such disputes because it regulated the whole liturgical year. If one group marked a feast on one day and another marked it on another, the disagreement was not cosmetic. It touched the temple, the covenant, and the meaning of communal life before God. Seen in that light, Jubilees becomes more than a retelling of Genesis and Exodus. It becomes a polemical text, though not in a noisy way. Its argument is woven into the fabric of sacred history itself. The author does not merely say, "Our calendar is correct." He reaches back to creation, the patriarchs, and Sinai, and suggests that the true ordering of time was always there, inscribed from the beginning. To reject that order is not just to make an error, it is to step out of alignment with the divine pattern. This has consequences for how the book handles the patriarchs and festivals. Jubilees frequently portray central figures observing laws and sacred dates in ways that anticipate later Torah practice. This can feel strange to modern readers trained to notice historical sequence. How can Abraham or Jacob be shown keeping patterns associated more clearly with later revelation? But ancient interpretive literature often works this way. It assumes that what is revealed later was already true earlier. The patriarchs become models not only because they lived before the law, but because they somehow embodied the law in advance, woven into the fabric of covenant destiny. That habit of reading backward can frustrate modern historical instincts, yet it tells us something vital about the book's purpose. Jubilees is not trying to satisfy detached curiosity about the past. It is trying to secure a threatened present. If sacred time is contested in the author's own community, then sacred time must be rooted as deeply as possible. The earliest generations must already testify to it. Heaven itself must endorse it. The calendar must feel ancient enough to command obedience. This is also why the book's tone can feel uncompromising. Once time is sanctified, deviation is dangerous. The wrong calendar does not merely produce scheduling confusion, it fractures holiness. It teaches a people to worship out of step with the order God established. For communities already anxious about contamination from rival powers, foreign customs, or compromised leadership, that argument carried tremendous emotional weight. The Dead Sea Scrolls again help us hear these tensions. The Qumran community appears to have maintained strong calendrical convictions and a deep sense that the dominant temple order in Jerusalem was corrupt or mistaken in crucial ways. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between Jubilees and that community, but the resonances are real. Concern for purity, sharp covenant boundaries, structured time, and suspicion toward rival religious authority. Jubilees fit a world in which fidelity required not only belief, but separation. Yet the calendar is only one example of a broader principle. The book repeatedly insists that divine reality is ordered, measurable, and morally coherent. Time is holy, genealogy is meaningful, angelic mediation is real, evil is constrained but active. Israel's distinctiveness is ancient. This system gives the book its force, but it may also help explain why later readers were cautious. A text that answers so many questions, and answers them so firmly, can become both compelling and difficult. It nourishes those who want a tightly structured map of sacred history. It unsettles those who think scripture should leave more silence intact. That tension is not a failure of the book. It is part of its historical significance. Jubilees shows us that ancient biblical interpretation was not thin, timid, or merely repetitive. It was bold enough to reshape the way stories were heard. It could pull law backward into the age of the patriarchs, pull heaven closer to earth, and turn the calendar into a battleground of covenant loyalty. By the time we reach this point, the real question is no longer why some readers found the book fascinating. The real question is why some communities kept it close, while others, slowly and deliberately, decided not to place it at the center of their public scripture. Chapter 6, The Easy Story, says that powerful men gathered in one room, chose the books they liked, and banned the rest. It is clean, dramatic, and almost always wrong. The formation of biblical canons was slower than that, messier than that, and far more human. For the Hebrew Bible, there was no single moment at which all Jewish communities everywhere agreed on every boundary and then never looked back. Certain books stood at the center early and strongly. The Torah above all, then prophetic and other writings increasingly received, copied, taught, and debated. But reception was lived out across generations. Books became authoritative through use in worship, teaching, legal reflection, communal memory, and the recognition that these texts bore the weight of God's dealings with Israel in a way others did not. That recognition could be deep and widespread, without being identical in every place at every time. The Christian story added another layer. Early Christians inherited Israel's scriptures, often in Greek translation, and then gradually recognized a body of apostolic writings alongside them. Different churches used somewhat different collections before broad consensus settled. Language mattered, region mattered, liturgical practice mattered, theology mattered. A book heard in one church every year might be unknown in another. A text respected for edification might not be read as scripture in public worship. Authority had texture. Within that slow process, books like Jubilees occupied an ambiguous space. It was old enough to command respect, influential enough to leave traces, theologically rich enough to nourish some communities. Yet it also sat at a certain angle to the books that later formed the common center. It retold Torah, but was not Torah. It expanded hidden things with unusual confidence. It pressed on calendars, angels' spirits, and primeval details in ways some communities may have considered too sectarian, too interpretive, or too distant from the plain inherited core. That does not mean ancient leaders sat down and declared, "This book is dangerous, therefore suppress it." More often, a text was simply not granted the same liturgical or communal status as others. It might be read, quoted, or valued without becoming canonical in the strict sense. Over time, such distinctions harden. A book widely copied and publicly read keeps its life. A book respected but peripheral may survive in some circles and fade in others. Canon, in practice, is not only a theological list, it is a history of repeated communal decisions. Jasher is different because we cannot watch its later reception. The line of transmission disappears too early. But even there, the same principle applies. A text can be authoritative within one moment of biblical memory and still fail to survive the long chain of copying. The Bible's reference does not guarantee later preservation. It tells us only that when Joshua and Samuel took the shape we know, the memory of Jasher still carried weight. One reason conspiracy stories keep returning is that they flatter modern instincts. They suggest there was once a fuller, freer, more dramatic truth, and that institutions crushed it. Sometimes institutions do narrow possibilities. Sometimes power does suppress voices. History is not innocent, but in the case of biblical canon, the evidence points more often to dispersed processes of reception than to a single act of removal. Communities did not agree because a secret order forced them to. They agreed gradually because certain books kept proving central in worship, doctrine, and identity, while others did not. There was also caution, and caution is not always fear. A community may judge that a text, however ancient or interesting, pushes beyond what should govern the faith of the whole people. That is especially understandable when a book deals in speculative chronology, extensive angelology, or expanded details not plainly rooted in the shared scriptural core. To say that later communities were cautious about Jubilees is not to accuse them of hiding truth. It may simply mean they were trying to preserve a center of gravity. Even then, the story never becomes uniform. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved Jubilees within its canon, just as it preserved 1 Enoch. That should prevent simplistic conclusions in either direction. If one tradition can receive the book as scripture and another cannot, then the real issue is not merely age or survival. It is how different worshipping communities understood continuity, authority, and the shape of revelation. So the canon question is not solved by suspicion, and it is not solved by pretending the borders were obvious from the start. The canon emerged through prayer, conflict, teaching, copying, memory, and judgment. It was historical and theological at once, and the existence of books like Jasher and Jubilees does not weaken that story. It deepens it. It shows that the people who preserved scripture also lived among other writings, other interpretations, and other claims. The Bible did not descend into history without neighbors. It came to us through a crowded world, and part of understanding it is learning why some voices became central while others remained at the edge. Chapter 7. What then do these books actually reveal about the world of the Bible and the world around it? Not simply extra facts, something deeper than that. They reveal how ancient communities remembered, argued, and hoped. Start with Jasher. Because it is lost, we are tempted to turn it into whatever we want. A missing prophetic chronicle, a suppressed revelation, a poetic national archive, a vessel containing the answers to questions Scripture leaves unresolved. But its very absence disciplines that desire. Jasher reminds us that the Bible came from a larger literary landscape than the one we can now fully recover. Israel remembered in more forms than the surviving canon preserves. There were songs, annals, royal records, prophetic collections, wisdom traditions, and perhaps texts cherished for a season and then lost. The canon did not erase that world, it emerged from it. That matters because modern readers often approach scripture as a sealed object rather than a living history of transmission. The mention of Jasher cracks that seal. It tells us that even within the Bible, there is memory of prior writing. The biblical authors were not ashamed to stand in relation to sources, songs, archives, and inherited tradition. Inspiration, in the biblical world, does not always appear as isolation. Sometimes it appears as faithful reuse, shaping, preserving, and discerning within a long chain of remembrance. Jubilees reveals a different truth. It shows what happens when a community leans into the spaces Scripture leaves open. It asks, if Genesis is true, what else follows? If Sinai reveals the order of covenant, how far back does that order reach? If evil has corrupted humanity so deeply, what is happening in the unseen world? If worship must be kept rightly, how should sacred time be measured? Those are not foolish questions. They are the questions of people who take revelation seriously and want to live by it in a dangerous age. The answers Jubilees gives are not the only possible answers, and later communities often decided they should not be the normative ones. Yet the book preserves the intensity of a certain Jewish imagination in the Second Temple period. Disciplined, apocalyptic at times, law-centered, fiercely committed to holiness, and convinced that history on earth corresponds to patterns in heaven. In that sense, Jubilees is not simply an odd supplement. It is a witness to how Scripture was actively interpreted before the New Testament era, and around the same broad world that also produced groups like those behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. This becomes especially important for understanding how varied ancient Judaism really was. The word Judaism can mislead if it suggests a single seamless voice. In reality, Second Temple Judaism contained deep common commitments and sharp internal disagreements. All kinds of Jews honored the God of Israel, revered ancestral texts, and lived under foreign empires. Yet they differed over priesthood, purity, resurrection, wisdom law, angels, apocalyptic expectation, and the right way to preserve covenant life. Jubilees belongs to that internal conversation. It is evidence of depth, not deviation from the existence of depth. It also helps explain parts of the early Christian world. The New Testament does not quote Jubilees directly as scripture in the way it quotes the law, prophets, or psalms. But early Christianity arose in a Jewish environment where ideas about angels, demons, cosmic conflict, sacred history, and eschatological judgment were already rich and varied. Texts like Jubilees and Enoch show the atmosphere in which many first-century beliefs became intelligible. Even when later churches did not canonize these books, they could not entirely escape the categories they helped normalize. And then there is Ethiopia. The survival of Jubilees, there is one of the most important reminders that Christian history cannot be reduced to the Latin West or the Greek East. Ethiopian Christianity developed in conversation with wider Christian traditions and local history alike, preserving a biblical canon that kept books many other churches left aside. That is not a footnote. It is proof that the story of Scripture is global, layered, and more diverse than many modern readers were taught. If all this is true, then the lesson of these books is not that the Bible is unstable or that hidden archives will overturn the faith. The lesson is almost the opposite. The biblical tradition proved strong enough to move through a wide and crowded textual world without losing its center. Around it stood books that amplified, argued, supplemented, and interpreted. Some were treasured locally, some disappeared, some survived at the edges. But the canon that most Jews and Christians came to share did not emerge because no other voices existed. It emerged because, among many voices, some continued to bear the weight of public trust in a unique way. That does not make the other voices worthless. It makes them witnesses of a different sort. Jasher witnesses by absence. Jubilees witnesses by survival. Together they force us to see the Bible not as a lonely monument dropped from heaven, but as scripture preserved through history, among people who copied, debated, prayed, forgot, remembered, and tried, with all their limits, to hand on what they believed God had truly given. Chapter 8. In the end, the mystery of lost biblical texts is not solved by recovering every answer. It is deepened by learning which answers history no longer lets us have. The book of Jasher remains one of those absences. We know just enough to feel its weight, and not enough to reconstruct its voice. Somewhere behind Joshua's battlefield and David's lament there once stood a written memory, now gone from the earth. No museum shelf can give it back. No late forgery can fill its place. The honest response is not frustration alone, but humility. Scripture itself points beyond its surviving pages to a wider world of memory, and then teaches us to live without total possession of that world. Jubilees asks for a different kind of humility. It survives. It can be read. It speaks with clarity and force. But surviving is not the same as settling the question of authority. The book opens a window into an age when Jews were not only preserving old traditions, but pressing them into new argument about time, holiness, evil, origins, and covenant identity. It allows us to hear a serious and passionate interpretive voice from the centuries before Christ. Yet it also asks us to notice the line between canonical narrative and later expansion, between what the Torah states and what a later text concludes, between shared center and contested edge. That line should not frighten us. The existence of these books does not mean the formation of Scripture was corrupt. It means it was historical. Real communities received real texts under real pressures. They did not preserve everything. They did not all preserve the same things. And still, through all that human contingency, the writings at the center endured with remarkable stability. The Torah endured. The prophets endured. The great psalms of grief, praise, and kingship endured. The Gospels and apostolic witness endured in the Christian tradition. The presence of neighboring books does not erase that endurance. It helps explain the world through which it came. There is also a spiritual question here, one that ancient readers knew well. How much detail does faith require? Some are drawn toward every missing fragment, every ancient retelling, every text that promises to illuminate the shadows. Others are content with the harder discipline of the canonical center, where certain questions remain unanswered and certain silences are allowed to stand. That tension is not merely modern. Jubilees itself was born inside it. So was the interest in Jasher. Some believers have always wanted the wider archive. Others have always feared that the wider archive can distract from what is necessary. Neither instinct is entirely foolish. Curiosity can become obsession, but it can also be reverence for history. Caution can become narrowness, but it can also be wisdom. The challenge is to hold both without surrendering honesty. Read what survives. Distinguish clearly. Resist the urge to turn every ancient text into either treasure or threat. Let lost books remain lost. Let surviving books speak in their own register. And let the canon be understood, neither as a prison nor as an accident, but as a tradition of discernment shaped over time. There is something fitting in the fact that the story ends where it began, with a text pointing beyond itself. Joshua pauses and says the event was written elsewhere. David's lament carries an echo of a book now gone. Jubilees retells ancient history and insists that heaven itself has preserved the deeper pattern. The Ethiopian church keeps reading what many others left aside. The caves near the Dead Sea yield fragments that remind us how much more crowded the scriptural past once was. Each piece says the same thing in a different tone. The world of the Bible was never thin, and maybe that is the final gift of these forgotten writings. They do not merely add mystery, they restore scale. They remind us that revelation moved through history among languages, empires, arguments, songs, scrolls, and communities scattered across deserts, cities, mountains, and trade routes. They remind us that faith was never lived in abstraction, but in the hard work of remembering what must be remembered and letting go of what could not be kept. So the Book of Jasher remains a wound in the archive. The Book of Jubilees remains a living witness from the borderlands of canon. One is silence, one is speech, one is a missing name cited with trust, one is a surviving voice received with disagreement. Together they do not close the question of what has been preserved or omitted and why. They make the question more serious, and that may be the right ending, not a tease, not a claim that the hidden truth lies one discovery away. Only this: the Bible came down to us through history, not around it. Some books were kept at the center, some stood nearby, some vanished. To recognize that is not to weaken Scripture. It is to see more clearly the cost of transmission and the strange mercy of survival. Across all that loss and debate, words remained. Enough remained for covenant, for memory, for warning, for hope, and for the long human work of listening.